The story of the Pride of Baltimore isn't just the story of a ship. It's the story of at least 3 ships and an entire city with a rich, proud, yet troubled history. It's a story that spans over 200 years, and the end is not yet written. Before we begin, let me first say thank you for watching. When I made my first video a month ago, I never expected anyone to find it. Never in my wildest dreams did I think the story of the bounty would be viewed more than 100,000 times. It means the world to me that you watch, so thank you. It takes a long time to research, write, and edit these videos, so if you like them, please subscribe, it goes a long way. And if you have any suggestions for video topics, ways I can improve, or any kind of feedback at all, please let me know in the comments. I read nearly all of them, even if I don't always respond. The topic for this video was suggested to me by Keith Staten. Thanks, Keith. Alright, on to the topic of the video. Baltimore. Charm City. Ravens, bows, crabs and O's, Old Bay rats and Edgar Allan Poe. Baltimore is a proud city with a rich history and a colorful blend of diverse cultures that come together to produce unique art, cuisine, and industries. It's a city I know and love, as it's actually where I call home. There are so many good things, historical figures, and incredible accomplishments that the city of Baltimore is responsible for that I can't list them all without going on forever. During the Battle of Baltimore in the War of 1812, Baltimore's Fort McHenry repelled invading British forces for 4 days, killing their commander in the process. The events inspired Francis Scott Key to write the poem The Defense of Fort McHenry, which would eventually become the Star-Spangled Banner, the national anthem of the United States. Baltimore, being a major port city, has a rich maritime history. Historically, Baltimore was world-renowned for shipbuilding. In particular, for the Baltimore Clipper, a small, fast-sailing vessel ideal for transporting perishable goods along the Atlantic coast and Caribbean islands. Perhaps the most famous Baltimore Clipper of all time was the Chasseur. The Chasseur was no merchant vessel. She was the deadliest and most feared American privateer of the War of 1812. 120 feet long and armed with 16 guns, the Chasseur was ferocious, fearless, and faster and nimbler than the lumbering British man-of-war frigates of the time. She took full advantage of her maneuverability to pick apart the British supply lines. Depending on the source, the Chasseur captured 6 to 11 British ships, the majority of which she burned after relieving them of their supplies and valuables. The Chasseur wasn't just brutally efficient, she had moxie too. The captain, Thomas Boyle of Baltimore, had the audacity to sail to the English Channel and by himself declare a blockade of the entire United Kingdom. His proclamation read, "Whereas it has become customary with the admirals of Great Britain to declare all the coasts of the United States in a state of strict and rigorous blockade without possessing the power to justify such a declaration, I do therefore, by virtue of the power and authority vested in me, declare all the ports, harbors, bays, creeks, rivers, inlets, outlets, islands, and seacoast of the United Kingdom of Great Britain in a state of strict and rigorous blockade. Given under my hand on board the Chasseur, Thomas Boyle." The Chasseur was so legendary and beloved that the ship, Captain Thomas Boyle, and the crew were collectively referred to as the Pride of Baltimore. Baltimore's maritime excellence continues to this day. When the global supply chain ground to a halt in the wake of COVID-19 lockdowns and labor shortages, the Port of Baltimore kept things moving. While 109 container ships were waiting in line to enter the Port of Los Angeles, ships flowed smoothly in and out of the Port of Baltimore. Ships even diverted from other ports to unload their cargo in Baltimore because it was faster to go out of their way to Baltimore than to wait in line at the other overwhelmed ports. There's a good chance that some of the consumer goods you use every day pass through the Port of Baltimore. Today, the city features world-class museums, theaters, hospitals, and research institutions. It's the home of the National Aquarium, the oldest music conservatory in the nation, and a unique dialect.
Baltimore accents say this phrase out loud. Earn, and earn. Hold on, Aaron, and iron, earn. Damn, what the f? We really talk like that?
Baltimore is of course famous for its blue crabs, crab cakes, and Chesapeake Bay oysters, but its central location along the Atlantic coast makes it a melting pot for New England, Mid-Atlantic, and Southern cuisines. Try the lake trout. It's not trout and it's not from a lake, but don't think about it too much. It's good. It's also a city that admittedly faces real challenges and struggles to maintain a positive reputation. It's no secret that Baltimore has some of the highest violent crime, poverty, and homeless rates in the nation, and it's often in the news for the wrong reasons. Corruption is so common that nobody even blinks an eye when a new scandal comes to light involving the local government. We have one of the highest tax rates and yet the worst infrastructure, schools, and crime. The city's negative reputation is compounded by the fact that most depictions of the city in popular culture focus on the crime and the corruption. It's gotten to the point that when people think of Baltimore, they think of violent crime and corruption and not any of the amazing good things the city has to offer. This image issue is nothing new. It's something the city has been struggling with for a long time. And so, in 1975, city leaders came up with an idea to bring some positive attention to the city. Construct an authentic 18th century Baltimore clipper in the city's inner harbor, where everyone could see it. Then, she would sail around the world, serving as an ambassador for the city of Baltimore and a symbol that the people could be proud of. Her name? The Pride of Baltimore. In 1975, Baltimore was in a period of slow economic decline. It was no longer the hub of industry and manufacturing that it once was. People began to realize that the city's inner harbor could be a new center for tourism and recreation, and began replacing old warehouses and industrial buildings with shops, restaurants, and bars. City officials wanted to do something big to celebrate this renaissance and to generate some positive attention for the city. City Housing Commissioner Bob Embry is credited with the idea. Let's build a ship in the inner harbor to draw folks downtown. It was a brilliant idea. They would construct an authentic replica of an early 19th century Baltimore clipper, using traditional materials, manufacturing methods, and tools of the period. All of this would take place in the inner harbor of downtown Baltimore, so everybody could see. The name of the ship would be the Pride of Baltimore. It was the perfect name that captured the city's strength of spirit and alluded to the legendary Baltimore clipper, Chasseur. The Pride was designed by Thomas Gilmer, a renowned naval architect and professor at the United States Naval Academy in nearby Annapolis, Maryland. The Pride was 90 feet long on deck and characterized by steeply raked masts and a broad white stripe along the gunwale. The ballast included stones from the streets of Baltimore, so a part of the city could travel with her to all the corners of the world. The design of the ship heavily emphasized authenticity. The only modern features were an 85 horsepower diesel engine for navigating harbors, a radio, self-inflating life rafts, emergency beacons that had to be manually activated, and a LORAN, which is a World War II era navigation system. Notable omissions were watertight bulkheads, a modern GPS navigation system, or an automatic emergency signaling system. Construction took place on the west shore of the inner harbor, next to the Maryland Science Center, in full view of the public. After 10 months, in February 1977, the Pride was launched. Barbara Mikulski, a member of the United States House of Representatives at the time, who would go on to become a United States Senator, cracked the traditional bottle of champagne against the hull. The Pride was commissioned by Baltimore Mayor William Schaefer on behalf of the citizens of the city of Baltimore and the state of Maryland in May 1977. The ceremony took place in Baltimore's inner harbor and was attended by thousands. Mayor Schaefer would go on to become the governor of Maryland. The Pride of Baltimore sailed as an ambassador of goodwill, bringing attention to the resurgence of Baltimore, promoting maritime education, and fostering relationships with other cities around the globe. She was a titan from another age, brought to life again before us, a symbol of Baltimore's proud maritime history and of the resilience of the city and its peoples. On her maiden voyage, she visited Bermuda, New York, and Nova Scotia. Throughout her 9 years of service, she logged more than 150,000 nautical miles, equivalent to 6 times around the globe. She visited ports that had not seen a Baltimore clipper in 200 years. Sadly, the Pride of Baltimore was not destined to sail forever. In May of 1986, the Pride of Baltimore was concluding another international voyage. She had visited various ports in Western Europe and was on her way home to Baltimore. Throughout her 9 years of service, the Pride had had several captains, but on her last fateful voyage in 1986, the captain was Armin Chasseur III. Armin had been sailing his whole life. As a teenager, he crewed ships around Buzzards Bay in Massachusetts. His family was well-to-do, and they eventually purchased their own sailboat that Armin used to sail around the Elizabeth Islands with friends. Armin attended the Ivy League University of Pennsylvania and then served in the Navy during the Vietnam War until his discharge in 1969. After that, he returned to Buzzards Bay and worked various maritime-related jobs, including ferryboat captain and shipbuilder. He crewed aboard numerous sailing ships over the years and eventually earned his Master of Sail license. Sailing was everything to Armin. He had had several relationships, including a marriage, but they all fell apart because he couldn't stop going on long sailing expeditions that prevented him from calling any place on land home for too long. By 1986, Armin was 42 years old, had over 25 years of sailing experience, and had been the captain of the Pride of Baltimore for the past 7. As is typical, while the captain was a seasoned sailor with decades of experience, the crew was more of a mix. The first mate was John Sugar Flanagan, a 27-year-old New England native with several years of sailing experience who had sailed aboard the Pride numerous times before. His 29-year-old girlfriend, Leslie McNish, was joining them as the bosun. Sugar and Leslie had met 4 years ago on a previous voyage aboard the Pride and had been dating ever since. The second mate was 27-year-old Joe McEady. A native of Baltimore, Joe also had previous sailing experience aboard the Pride. Their engineer was 27-year-old Vinny Lazaro, a commercial fisherman who was an experienced mariner but was new to old-fashioned sailing. The ship's carpenter was 29-year-old Barry Duckworth, who loved sailing but could barely swim. The rest of the crew had very little experience in sailing. Among them were the cook, 25-year-old James Chesney, and 5 novice seamen who just wanted to learn about sailing: 26-year-old Robert Foster Jr., 23-year-old Daniel Krashuk, 27-year-old Scott Jeffrey, 23-year-old Susie Husman, and 23-year-old Nina Shack. In all, there were 12 sailors aboard the Pride of Baltimore. The 4 officers in charge, Captain Armin, First Mate Sugar Flanagan, Second Mate Joe McEady, and Bosun Leslie McNish, all had years of experience on the Pride and other boats, and all 4 had Coast Guard licenses. It was regarded as a remarkably experienced group. None of the sailors were in it for the money. The crew pay ranged from just $400 a month for the deckhands to $900 a month for the first mate. Captain Armin received an annual salary of $22,500. The group either loved sailing or wanted to learn how to sail, had a passion for the ocean, and wanted to be a part of the adventure. The Pride was waiting for the crew to assemble in Malaga, Spain. It was scheduled to conduct a tour of the Mediterranean. However, as the crew was gathering to continue the journey, President Ronald Reagan issued an order for all Americans to leave Libya in response to recent terror attacks in Europe.
My fellow Americans, at 7 o'clock this evening, Eastern Time, air and naval forces of the United States launched a series of strikes against the headquarters, terrorist facilities, and military assets that support Muammar Gaddafi's subversive activities. The attacks were concentrated and carefully targeted to minimize casualties among the Libyan people, with whom we have no quarrel. From initial reports, our forces have succeeded in their mission.
There had just been an attack in an airport in Rome and even a cruise ship hijacking. The Pride's board of directors, based in Baltimore, figured if terrorists were willing to take over a cruise ship, why wouldn't they hijack a sailboat? The Pride, with its American flag and publicity-oriented mission, might make an attractive target to terrorists. As such, it was decided that the Pride would forego its planned Mediterranean tour and return straight home to Baltimore. On March 27, 1986, the Pride left Malaga and set off across the Atlantic. It was a 2,800-mile-long journey that was expected to take at least 2 weeks. The ship's radio was being difficult, and it was tedious to operate. It took a very long time to make contact using it, so Armin notified the board of directors in Baltimore that on the voyage, he would check in every 3 days instead of every day. As they set out, he wrote in his captain's log, "And so, without the usual fanfare, we slipped out of the harbor, 12 brave souls in a small but well-found ship, heading out into the vast lonely wastes of the sea." As they left, the skies were overcast and the ocean gray. It was a dreary scene that reflected the disappointment of the crew as a result of the cancelled Mediterranean tour. However, they soon spotted dolphins dancing off the bow, and in the coming days the sun began to break through. The ocean became blue, and spirits were high. Armin wrote, "Now we are flying. As we come off the foamy white crests of sapphire seas, the Pride lifts her head 4 to 5 feet beyond the waterline. The power, the energy, the giddy feeling of soaring through liquid blue space." The conditions were perfect. Armin joked, "We haven't tacked in days. How will the crew get any practice tacking before joining in July's tall ship parade in New York?" It was actually a bit unusual how smooth the sailing was. The Pride was notoriously quirky and difficult to sail, particularly when it came to stability in rough weather. Armin was very familiar with these issues. During a previous trip in the Baltic Sea, steep waves combined with a sudden gust of wind knocked the Pride onto its side, flinging crew members overboard. Thankfully, the ship righted itself and all crew members were recovered and unharmed, but the ordeal made a big impact on Armin. He told the Pride's board of directors, "This ship, when we get back to Baltimore, it needs to be tested. I don't trust it. The weight distribution of a ship is a major factor in its stability. Ideally, the center of mass of the ship is well below the center of buoyancy, so that it stays upright. If the center of mass were above the center of buoyancy, the ship would want to flip upside down. The lower the center of mass, the more stable the ship. To keep the center of mass low, ships have a ballast, heavy material placed low in the vessel. Modern ships often have an external ballast, which hangs below the vessel, ensuring the center of mass is as low as possible. Because the Pride of Baltimore was designed to be an authentic replica, it only had internal ballast. Having only internal ballast had a few drawbacks. The center of mass was not as low as it could be, and the ballast could shift if the boat heeled sharply. If the ballast shifted, it would be almost impossible for the ship to right itself. Now, these issues with the ballast were well understood by everybody involved. The designer, Thomas Gilmer, understood these challenges and came up with a design for an internal ballast that produced a stable vessel. However, there were some further issues that arose. Originally, the Pride was not intended to sail the open ocean. It was initially designed to only sail along the coast. As such, Gilmer specified 25 tons of iron ballast in his initial design. Later, when plans were revised to allow the Pride to sail out to sea, Gilmer specified 30 tons of ballast, and he said that they should change from iron to lead. Lead was denser than iron, so it would sit lower in the hull and ensure the center of mass was as low as possible. But lead was nearly 3 times as expensive, so the city and shipbuilders compromised and got ballast that was a 50-50 mix of iron and lead. Gilmer didn't like this and called for increasing the ballast again to 50 tons. The Pride would never get 50 tons of ballast. After the original 30 tons of iron and lead had been purchased, the city had no funds left. They managed to secure an additional 10 tons of ballast by repurposing paving stones from the city's streets. The stones were low density relative to the metals and filled up the remaining space. Ultimately, the ship had a total of 40 tons of ballast, a mix of lead, iron, and stone. The missing 10 tons of ballast reduced the stability of the ship, essentially making it more top-heavy. During the layover in Malaga and the beautiful sail across the Atlantic, a romantic relationship began to blossom between Vinny and Nina. Nina even went so far as to send a letter to her mother saying, "The engineer, Vinny Lazaro. I really like him. He's 27 and he's a fisherman. He's got blue eyes, dark hair, and is about 6 feet. He invited me to visit in Connecticut. Maybe I will. Vinny is a man I could marry." This was at least the third relationship to begin aboard the Pride, as Sugar and Leslie had met sailing together, as had Captain Armin and his current girlfriend, Jennifer Lamb, who wasn't sailing with them at the time. After 16 days at sea, the Pride arrived in Barbados. The crew was eager to stretch their legs off the ship and began hopping from bar to bar. They had spent so long at sea and had crossed the entire ocean, they were celebrating. It felt like they were almost home, and the difficult part of the journey was behind them. For the next couple weeks, the Pride and its crew bounced around the Caribbean, inching their way closer to Baltimore. On May 11th, the Pride departed St. John Harbor in the U.S. Virgin Islands. It was the final stretch of their journey. They would head straight to the Chesapeake Bay. For the next 3 days, it was generally smooth sailing. On the morning of the 14th, the weather began to sour. The crew could see dark clouds gathering to the northeast off their starboard side, but they weren't too concerned. It didn't look that bad. But Armin was not taking any chances. He remembered what had happened in the Baltic Sea. He commanded the crew to put on their harnesses to prevent them from being thrown overboard. The crew were surprised. The conditions didn't seem dangerous. But Armin was uneasy, and they could tell. The Pride continued along for the next few hours. The conditions were steady. All of the crew members were above deck, wearing their harnesses, except for Ches. Ches was preparing meals below deck. Suddenly, the dark clouds off the starboard side rushed towards them. It was a squall. The abrupt, violent wind was careening towards them almost directly from the right side. There was no time to drop sails, and Armin had to think fast. He made a split-second decision to try to let out the sails, turn to port, and run with the wind until it blew itself out. He yanked the tiller to starboard and yelled, "Clip in! Hold on!" But it was no use. The ferocious wall of wind barreled into the Pride at 80 knots, knocking her onto her port side. The ocean waves washed over the sails, and water flooded into the bulkhead. Armin knew there were no watertight bulkheads, and there was no way to right the ship. The Pride would soon sink. He shouted, "Abandon ship! Cut your harnesses! Abandon ship!" The crew was scrambling. It was chaos. Vinny tried to make his way toward Nina. Joe made his way to where all of the crew members' harnesses were tethered and began cutting them. Robert tried to pry open one of the sealed hatches down to the below deck, where Ches was, but he couldn't get it open without the appropriate tools. The only hatch that was already open was already underwater. Sugar was trying to launch the life rafts, but they were already underwater. He swam down, under the sinking ship, to try to reach the rafts, but was struck by the tiller, which was swinging out of control. He couldn't reach the rafts, but thankfully they freed themselves and began drifting out to sea. Joe managed to swim to them and activated the CO2 cartridges to inflate them, but they were both damaged and only partially inflated. Within 2 minutes, the ship had sunk. The Pride of Baltimore was lost. There were 8 crew members huddled around the partially inflated life rafts. 4 were missing: Vinny and Nina, the new couple, Barry Duckworth, who couldn't swim, and Captain Armin, who was spotted swimming toward the sinking Pride before disappearing. Their fates were unknown, but since the squall had come and went so suddenly, the 8 survivors believed the other 4 were alive and just separated from them. The survivors' ordeal was just beginning. They had not had time to activate the ship's manual emergency beacon, and since they had not maintained constant radio contact with anyone, no one would notice for several days that anything was amiss. They were alone, and they knew nobody was looking for them. All they had were 2 damaged and partially inflated rafts that nobody could board without sinking, 20 biscuits of concentrated food, a 5-gallon jug and 7 cans of water, 3 flares, 2 flashlights, a bucket, and each other. Before too long, they spotted something yellow coming in and out of view across the waves. It was one of their foul weather suits. Inside was Nina, face down, drowned. In this moment, the severity of the situation came crashing down on them. Not everyone was going to survive this. For about half an hour, Nina's body floated beside the gathered crew. Everyone had been wearing the yellow foul weather gear except for Ches, who was below deck at the time of the incident. He was getting cold, and hypothermia would soon set in. The group made a difficult decision. They decided to recover Nina's foul weather gear so that Ches could make use of it. They stripped Nina of her gear and pushed her body out to sea. Sometime later, maybe an hour after the Pride had sunk, the crew heard moans. It was Barry. In what could only be described as a miracle, Barry, who could barely swim, had managed to tread water this entire time. The group made their way to Barry with the life rafts, but they could tell he was not all right. His lips were blue, and his stomach was distended from the large volume of seawater he had ingested. The damaged life rafts couldn't support anybody lying on them, so crew members took turns holding Barry above water so he could rest as they treaded and clung to the rafts. Barry's condition never improved. He vomited seawater and lost consciousness. He passed away sometime that afternoon. The crew had put so much effort into trying to keep Barry alive that his death was a massive blow to morale. They were helpless, alone in the ocean, and it felt like just a matter of time until they all shared the same fate. As they drifted for hours, Leslie broke the silence. She turned to her boyfriend Sugar and said, "Sugar, if we ever live through this, you and I, we're going to get married." Sugar replied, "Sure, Leslie. If we survive, we'll get married. Just keep swimming." The crew entertained themselves with plans for the wedding. There would be a big party. Joe would be the best man, and Susie the maid of honor. Leslie had managed to raise morale. The group had something to fight on for. Later that evening, the survivors made it their goal to repair and inflate one of the life rafts. They needed to locate and seal whatever was causing it to leak, and then inflate it by manually blowing into it while treading water in the open ocean. It was a seemingly impossible task for the exhausted crew. Ches eventually realized that the source of the leak was the inflation valve. It was supposed to seal itself and prevent air from leaking out, but it wasn't sealing. That was bad, but it meant that the valve only leaked when it was open. Ches managed to keep his mouth over the valve and inhale through his nose, thereby preventing the valve from leaking as he blew air into the raft. Ches kept this up for over an hour and managed to inflate the raft. The 8 survivors piled into the raft meant for 6. They were crowded and beyond exhausted, but for the first time since the Pride sank at least 6 hours ago, they didn't need to tread water. They could rest. Over the next 4 days, the survivors subsisted on a quarter of a biscuit and half cup of water per day. They launched their flares and flashed their lights at planes overhead and ships on the horizon, but no one noticed their signals. At least 5 vessels came and went without noticing them. They were alone, and they were running out of rations and hope. Finally, in the early hours of May 19th, after 4.5 days in the ocean, the tanker Toro Horton noticed their SOS flashlight signal. They were rescued. The survivors were a sight for sore eyes. They were hungry, exhausted beyond comprehension, and suffering from various rashes and injuries, including trench foot. They had their fill of fresh, cold water and warm food aboard the Toro, as well as showers. When the survivors were rescued by the Toro, they were finally able to get word out about the disaster. Over the following 5 days, the Coast Guard, Navy, Marine Corps, and Air Force mobilized 24 aircraft to look for Vinny Lazaro and Captain Armin, who were possibly alive. They were never found. The Coast Guard and the National Transportation Safety Board each conducted an investigation into the incident. They concluded that the Pride was simply overwhelmed by the sudden squall. The Pride's lack of external ballast contributed to its lack of stability, and the absence of watertight bulkheads allowed the ship to quickly fill with water when knocked suddenly onto its side. These design flaws were not the result of negligence or oversight, however. They were intrinsic limitations of the design choice, which emphasized authenticity. The investigations did note that the lack of regular communication from the Pride contributed to the disaster, as it significantly delayed an emergency response. At the end of the day, there is no general consensus on who is at fault for the disaster. Some think the design of the Pride should have included modern safety features in lieu of the period authenticity. Some think the Pride's board of directors should have insisted on remaining in daily contact, regardless of how tedious the radio was to operate, or that they should have acted to increase the stability of the vessel after Armin had previously raised concerns. Some think Armin should have handled the squall differently. And finally, some think that it was just a freak storm, an act of God, and those that chose to sail aboard the ship knew the risks of what they were signing up for. I'll let you come to your own conclusions. This was a dark time for the city of Baltimore. Crime and poverty were on the rise again. The middle class was moving out of the city, seeking an escape in the suburbs. Just 2 years before, the beloved Baltimore Colts had fled to Indianapolis in the middle of the night. And now, the pride of Baltimore was gone, literally and figuratively. But the people did not give up. An outpouring of unsolicited donations from the public encouraged the Pride of Baltimore Inc. to consider constructing a new ship. The organization had not had plans to construct another ship and did not ask for any donations to do so. The fundraising efforts were grassroots, organized by the people of Baltimore and the sailing community. In all, they raised over $2.5 million. The Pride of Baltimore would sail once again. Thomas Gilmer was again commissioned to design the Pride of Baltimore II. But this time, she was bigger, had watertight bulkheads, external ballast, engines that could carry her 1,200 miles without sails, modern GPS equipment, and a wheel instead of a tiller. The Pride of Baltimore II was commissioned in Baltimore's Inner Harbor on October 23, 1988, just 2 years after the sinking of the first. The Pride of Baltimore II is still sailing to this day. She has sailed over 250,000 nautical miles, equivalent to 10 times around the world, and has so far visited more than 200 ports in 40 countries. The story of the Pride of Baltimore is more than just the story of a ship. It's the story of a whole city, its rich, proud history, and its many complex challenges. It's the story of 3 ships and centuries of maritime history, past and present. Who knows what adventures the future holds? So come to Baltimore, see what the city has to offer, meet the people, experience the blend of cultures, and get out on the water. And if you're lucky, you might catch the Pride of Baltimore in her proud home.